So I have always loved fantasy books. There's something just so brilliant and enthralling about a world that's close enough to ours that when you really think about it, it really could exist. As a kid, I was deeply, deeply into it. Percy Jackson, Harry Potter, if it was fantasy and magic, I was there. Even if it may have aged really poorly. And so in middle school, when a family member recommended me a new fantasy series called Fable Haven, I was immediately locked in. The idea of this book is pretty simple. Across the world, unbeknownst to most humans, magical beings exist and they're being cared for in these sanctuaries and preserves across all nations. And that was literally all you needed to say to sell me. So, of course, that was years ago. I'm 21 now and recently made the decision to revisit the series to see if it still holds up. Especially because they literally just announced a movie. If you need someone who has never acted in their life to play literally any character, my business email is hanadarli@gmail.com, okay? If you're new here, which you likely are because this is my second video ever, my name is Hana Darli. I like to talk books, culture, and quite literally everything because I hate the idea of being stuck in some sort of niche, which is gonna bode very well for my impending YouTube career. It seems like Sebastian wants to make his first appearance on the channel today. He's purring, can you hear him? Do you have anything else to add? That's really good, bud, thanks. Oh, okay. He has a lot to say today. There has not been a single person in my real life who's known what this book series is. I mention it often because my friends and I like to reminisce on old stuff we used to enjoy, and this series is one of my picks. So today's video is kind of going to be an explanation of the series and the universe while I actively try and encourage you to read children's literature, which really means the rest of the series. I did say in my last video, don't always read serious stuff, so sorry. Also, Sebastian is really enjoying his time in my lap right now. Oh, so cute. Oh my god. Cat owners, when their cats do literally anything. He can do nothing. I'm like, oh my god. I digress. I actually just want to start off by reading you part of the publisher summary if you have literally no idea what the series is, because I think it gives a pretty good idea of what's going on in this whole universe. For centuries, mystical creatures of all description were gathered into a hidden refuge called Fable Haven to prevent their extinction. The sanctuary survives today as one of the last strongholds of true magic. Enchanting? Absolutely. Exciting? You bet. Safe? Well, actually quite the opposite. Kendra and her brother Seth have no idea that their grandfather is the current caretaker of Fable Haven. Inside the gated woods, ancient laws keep relative order among greedy trolls, mischievous satyrs, plotting witches, spiteful imps, and jealous fairies. However, when the rules get broken, Seth is a bit too curious and reckless for his own good. Powerful forces of evil are unleashed that cause Kendra and Seth to find the courage to do what they fear the most. Any YA fantasy series, the two protagonists that we get to follow are children. Specifically, Kendra and Seth Sorensen. They're set to stay with their grandparents while their parents leave to go on a cruise, which already is very classic children's fantasy setup. Remove the adults, create distance, allow discovery. What makes the setup interesting to me, though, is that the adults aren't absent because they're incompetent, which I think is a trope that a lot of middle grade and children's fantasy tends to fall into. Rather, in this situation, the adults are absent because they're hiding a lot of secrets. When Kendra and Seth arrive at their grandparents' estate, and mind you, I said estate because the property is literally massive, they slowly discover that their grandfather is the caretaker of Fable Haven, a preserve for magical creatures like I mentioned earlier. And then immediately this dynamic between siblings becomes the lens of which we experience this whole world. Kendra is our classic oldest sister, eldest daughter, any trope of that, you name it. She follows rules, she observes, she thinks before acting, and she has that very specific energy of I will absolutely do the right thing and be deeply anxious while doing it, which is something I understand very deeply. And then we have Seth. Seth is deeply curious in a way that is almost concerning. He doesn't just want to know what the rules are, he wants to test them, and test them he does. He's just driven by the question of what happens if I do this anyway, which is a really long way to say he's just an 11-year-old boy, so that makes sense. They were certainly created to be foils of each other, and Seth is honestly the reason the whole first book happens, very respectfully. Because this is a world that runs on rules, right? The structure of this world is kind of what sets it apart to me. Fable Haven is no fantasy portal to some mystical magical land through a wardrobe. Sorry, C.S. Lewis. It's just a wildlife preserve. Preserves all around the world quietly maintain this balance between the magical beings and the humans, which is fascinating to me because it implies bureaucracy. And yes, I am overanalyzing a middle grade fantasy series. Sue me. Or subscribe if you're into that. Anyway, magic is regulated and contractual here. Creatures are bound by agreements, certain areas are warded, and there are consequences for not just the humans, but also the creatures themselves if these laws are broken. Which again, does not bode well for Seth. literally at all. Seth's impulsiveness is not just creating these small, like, comedic mishaps like you would expect. It literally destabilizes magical systems that have been in place for centuries. His curiosity sets major events in motion, and the narrative does not reward his curiosity or his recklessness immediately. There are consequences, injuries, moments of fear, people be dying. But at the same time, the story never really turns him into a villain for being curious, which I think is important. Instead, it treats it as just a trait that needs refining. Across the series, he learns discernment. Slowly. Very slowly. But Kendra's arc across the series is also equally as important. She begins the story as so unsure of herself. She's cautious to the point of self-doubt, which I think a lot of us probably understand. But as the series progresses, her carefulness really becomes some of her strengths, right? Her reliability is a lot of the reason that a lot of characters come to trust her and rely on her throughout the series. The growth is gradual. It unfolds across 5 books, and that long arc is part of why revisiting this series as an adult feels satisfying. Something else that feels satisfying as an adult is how seriously Fable Haven treats its creatures. Also, I realize I don't need to hold the mic, but I kind of like doing a little, I don't know. Okay, moving on. These creatures are not mascots or cute companions at all. They're beings rooted in mythology with instincts, hierarchies, pride, hunger, vanity, and their own agendas. I think a lot of middle grade fantasy, especially in the post-Harry Potter boom, tends to divide magical creatures into 2 very distinct categories. You have the safe creatures who are allies, and then you have the evil creatures who are monstrous and pretty narratively disposable. The moral lines are drawn really early, and the reader immediately understands who to trust. Fable Haven, rather, does something closer to what old folklore actually was. In traditional mythology, especially thinking about European with the Brothers Grimm, magical beings were not safe. They were not there to assist humans, they were forces of nature, embodiments of appetite or temptation or decay. They operated by rules by which human beings were not necessarily privy to understand and often misunderstood at their own peril. Let's talk about the fairies, for example. Fairies in Fable Haven are luminous and breathtaking, there's no doubt about that. They're tied to light and beauty and pureness, but they're also really vain, can reward generosity but punish disrespect. Their assistance is extremely transactional, which aligns far more closely with traditional fae mythology rather than modern children's retellings. Same goes for naiads. Water nymphs, whose mythological origins often include seduction, danger, and drowning. In many ancient stories, water spirits were not guardians of safety. They're more so embodiments of nature's indifference, I would say. Step too close to the river, and it will take you. And in Fable Haven, sure, the naiads are beautiful, but they absolutely will kill you, and probably want to. The creatures in this world are not villains simply because they oppose the protagonists. They're dangerous because they're just themselves. Trolls are grotesque and aggressive, but they're also governed by rules. Witches are manipulative, but they're strategic rather than necessarily just chaotic. The satyrs are playful and charismatic, but at the end of the day, they're not inherently loyal. They will go to serve their own interests. But that kind of changes throughout the series. You just have to read it. Demons later in the series aren't necessarily cartoon antagonists. They're ancient forces bound by contracts and imprisoned by necessity. What ties all this together is really just the key principle that these beings were creatures first. They weren't waiting for the children to come in and give them some sort of narrative purpose. They already existed. And so this idea of magic predating the protagonists and will continue to last on after them, I think is really important and gives the story some weight, because it removes the sense that the story revolves and exists specifically for the children, and instead the children have been thrown into an already existing ecosystem with its own hierarchies and policies. And, you know, the first book of Fable Haven is relatively contained. Like I mentioned earlier, this is a 5-book series, and with the first one, the threat is local. The preserve itself is in danger, and the story unfolds almost like a locked estate mystery. We get to learn the rules at the same time as Kendra and Seth, and every new piece of information makes the woods feel slightly less charming and slightly more predatory. It has genuine suspense to me. And there's definitely some moments that also lean into horror. To be honest, the atmosphere does do a lot of the heavy lifting. Like, sure, the forest is charming and awesome, but the forest is also watching you. At this stage, the stakes are super clear. If Fable Haven falls, a century-old preserve collapses, and yeah, that feels pretty detrimental, but, you know, not the end of the world. But the series doesn't stay contained. With each book, I think Mull really widens the world in a way that feels super intentional rather than just being dramatic for drama's sake. First, we learn that Fable Haven is not unique. It is one preserve among many scattered across the globe. There are caretakers, other sanctuaries, and this revelation immediately scales up the world without necessarily overwhelming it. Then we get the artifacts. They are safeguards, keys, leverage used often. Once those enter the picture, the conflict expands past protecting just one estate to protecting that stability to protecting the entire preserve network. Add in secret societies with competing agenda, all of whom are backstabbing and crazy, by the way. The tension really just becomes ideological. It isn't any form of stop the monster because there's really no big bad, and when the series continues on, it becomes this question of what should happen to magic in this world. And then if you weren't already excited enough, the series introduces Zizix, which I have literally no idea how I'm supposed to pronounce, so I'm going to put it on the screen for you to make a guess, which is a prison built to contain ancient demons. At this point, we are no longer dealing with rogue trolls in the woods. We are dealing with apocalyptic level consequences. If the demon prison gets open, the world literally just goes up in flames. It's just over. And this escalation works, though, because it's mirroring the growth of the characters throughout the 5-book series. Kendra and Seth are not thrown into world-ending chaos on day one. They learn to survive one preserve before being asked to understand the whole network. They make smaller mistakes before facing larger consequences, and their stakes rise as their competence rises. By the time the story reaches global implications, we as the readers already kind of understand what's at risk. We've seen how fragile one sanctuary can be, and multiply that fragility all across the world, add ancient demons to the mix, and suddenly the scale makes a lot more sense. Which is what I think makes the final stakes hit a lot harder, because as the reader, then you remember back to when the biggest problem was just surviving the world in your grandparents' backyard. Let me stop here and be honest for a second. I am fully aware that I'm talking about the series like it is the greatest fiction of all time. At the end of the day, this is a middle grade fantasy series about 2 kids running around their grandparents' yard, woods, and the world, and just trying to survive some ancient beings and stop them from escaping. I know. This is not a 900-page grimdark epic with morally bankrupt war generals and a glossary in the back. There's no dense trade negotiations. There's no political council scene that lasts for 12 chapters. It is middle grade fantasy. The language is accessible, the characters are young, and the chapters move pretty quickly. And yes, nostalgia absolutely plays a role here. I read this when I was in middle school, and of course there's some sort of emotional attachment to that. And of course there's always a part of me that will associate this series with that era of reading that was just super magical because I was 12 and had a lot less responsibilities. But here's the thing. Nostalgia will only carry you so far. If something truly does not hold up, rereading it as an adult makes that extremely clear. Feel the cracks, you notice flat dialogue, and you realize the plot hinges on a lot of convenience, and the illusion kind of breaks. Not gonna lie, that didn't happen here for me. Is this simpler than adult fantasy? 100%. Is that inherently a flaw? No. There's something deeply refreshing about fantasy that does not require a dense political exposition to feel meaningful. Not every story needs 3 warring kingdoms, a kind of hot, morally ambiguous assassin, and a map that looks like somebody just scribbled all across the page. Sometimes a clearly defined magical system and strong character growth are enough. Fable Haven knows what it is, okay? It's structured, it's focused, it builds pretty logically. It doesn't drown the reader in lore for lore's sake or just for the story to feel more sophisticated. The world building is definitely there, but I think it serves the story rather than completely overwhelming it. Honestly, after reading an adult fantasy that kind of feels like it's just trying out for the Olympics of complexity, it's kind of nice to understand a story that just trusts in its simplicity and knows that it's getting done what it intended to do. So, if this series is this solid, mythologically grounded, carefully escalated, and emotionally constant, why does it feel like a fever dream every single time I have to explain to somebody what this is? And my theory here is timing. Fable Haven came out during that peak fantasy franchise domination. This was the era when Harry Potter still owned the cultural oxygen and Percy Jackson was sprinting into the spotlight with modern mythology and sarcasm. If your series did not have a blockbuster adaptation, a theme park ride, or at least one Tumblr renaissance, you were just kind of out of luck. The YA fantasy space was loud, and we all know that when a genre gets loud, there's a few series that will always come to the forefront. And I think Fable Haven just kind of quietly did its job. It didn't never become any sort of discourse factory, it just built its preserves, locked up its demons, and minded its business. Which I kind of love. Partially because I enjoy having a thing that I love be a little underground for the superiority complex of it all. Also because I think there's something a little poetic about a series that is centered on hidden magical preserves being slightly hidden in itself. It feels extremely on theme. Fable Haven feels personal when you find it. And that brings me to who the series is actually for. Children. Obviously. But if you enjoy magic systems where the rules actually matter, contracts, boundaries, and ancient agreements are foundational, this is for you. If you like contained environments that eventually and gradually rise into global stakes, rather than being thrown into a map with 17 kingdoms and a pronunciation guide, this is for you. And really, at the end of the day, if you are an adult who loves fantasy but does not currently have the bandwidth to memorize a fictional tax code, this is especially for you. So if you've never read Fable Haven, consider this a very calm, non-dramatic endorsement. If you read it a few years ago, maybe give it another look. Worst case scenario, you spend a few days in a magical preserve. Best case scenario, you remember why following the rules occasionally pays off. So, drink the milk, respect the boundaries, and maybe don't wait for a movie adaptation to tell you that something's worth reading. If you enjoyed this video, I'm glad because I had a lot of fun making it. I played around a little bit with the editing, so let me know what you think down below. If you're feeling extra super generous, I'd appreciate you throwing a like or a sub my way. Thanks for giving me some of your time today. I'll see you in the next one.